Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. While we're still awaiting the arrival for me to receive the program for today, I would like to welcome us all, and I would like to welcome us warmly. It's a very interesting day for me today. The whole week I was with practitioners, traditional practitioners, Mecca practitioners, chants practitioners. We were at the beachside at the foreshore, Natalira village in Telio, trying to revive traditional chants in Mecca. In a world where traditional chants practitioners are being demonized because of their practice, because they say that they speak to the spirit world. From there, I was a chief guest at Ndao Samu Primary School to close the drug awareness program this afternoon. And the next thing, I'm here as the master of ceremony for this program, the role of the media in democratic transition in divided societies. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the world that we live in today, where we will have to multitask and just grab the bull by the horn in order to make things to move forward. So I'm still waiting for this to arrive. Okay, anyway, ladies and gentlemen, we'll move on. In the essence of time, we will have to move on with our program for today. I tell you, this is going to be a very interesting program with the theme of the role of the media in democratic transition in divided societies. Ladies and gentlemen, our Pro-Chancellor, sitting in our midst, and also probably some other council members if we are here, I would like to take this moment to welcome you all. Ladies and gentlemen, members of academia and invited guests and colleagues. On behalf of our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Cherian George, and also our Pro-Chancellor, Pandit Buwan Dat, I would like to extend our sincere warm welcome to all who are present this afternoon. Historic in the sense because this is something that we haven't actually looked at. We've never thought about in the past few years up until today. This afternoon will be a very interesting afternoon, as we will have the opportunity to reflect on the role of the media and, most importantly, the role of journalists in a democratic transition, particularly when we are reflecting on the theme that we have this afternoon, the role of the media in democratic transition. In a world where information is one of the most powerful tools and agent for change, it is very important to define the importance of the media, the role of journalists, who do they represent, and who do they inform. Today is going to be a day of clarification, where we will revisit our roles. In the face of this modern society, the power of social media, where are we in this pedestal as we move on into the future? Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite our Vice-Chancellor, Madam VC.
Thank you, MC. Good afternoon, everyone. Professor Cherian George, our honored keynote speaker, ladies and gentlemen, and members of the council who are present today, as well as staff and students of the university. Good afternoon once again, namaste and bula vinaka. On behalf of the University of Fiji and Dialogue Fiji, as well as Dialogue Fiji's other partners and funders, I have great pleasure in welcoming you all, particularly our keynote speaker, who is from Singapore, a similar country to Fiji, I keep saying, but of course we know it's not. There's a vast difference in wealth between us, but nevertheless, I welcome you, sir, to tonight's event entitled The Role of the Media in Democratic Transition in Divided Societies. It's up there on the board. Professor George is clearly the expert on this topic, as his keynote will address how the media can contribute to bridging societal divides, promoting dialogues, and supporting democratic governance. He will be drawing from global studies to suggest ways in which his insights may be relevant to the Fijian media in its very difficult role in navigating the current environment to contribute to greater transparency, accountability, and social cohesion. This lecture is particularly appropriate in the University of Fiji's context because 2 years ago we developed and are now teaching a program in journalism and media studies which is unique. It is unique because it was developed with us by very senior and highly respected journalists in the industry, including in the Fiji Times, Fiji Sun, Fiji TV, and My TV. The JMS program is formally registered by the Fiji Higher Education Commission and is supported by both scholarships and student loans through our local tertiary student support scheme, the TSLS. This shows that the high authorities were supportive of the way in which the program was developed and offered to students. One of the most important aspects of the training is that students are sent to newsrooms from year one, and I'm pleased to report that our students received their initial bylines within the first 3 months, which was a proud moment for the university. In addition, with the help of experienced and very senior Fijian journalist and sub-editor Vimal Madhavan, the students also regularly publish Uni-Fiji Watch, an online newspaper. The first cohort of students will graduate this year in December, and of course many are already employed in a number of newsrooms, so their jobs are assured after graduation. Thus, we have a batch of students, soon to be graduates, who are future ready in the field of journalism. There is an issue, however, that I have regarding the role of journalists in the world currently, and that is appropriate to address here. Our topic today is about the role of the media in democratic transition in divided societies. That responsibility for the media packs a punch, for sure, and if we are to divide it up in sections, we have the following keywords: role, democratic, transition, and divided. Let me now put on my own journalist hat and express what I feel are issues with giving journalists in Fiji, at least, if not in other jurisdictions, such a huge responsibility. Yesterday, at the conference that Professor George attended, journalists were referred to, so the news report said, as the oxygen of democracy. I have also heard in the past that journalism is about truth-telling. Both are problematic observations, in my view. First, truth. If only people realized that the notion of truth is the most value-laden concept there is. What is truth to one person is outright lies to another. It's better to stick to facts. As for democracy, any self-respecting political scientist will tell you, and I have said this at a panel discussion hosted by CCF on the eve of the last Fijian elections as well, that democracy is a spectrum. On the one hand, left or right, as you like it, it can be seen as totalitarian democracy, and on the other side, as libertarian democracy. Liberal democracy is in the middle somewhere, but it slips quite easily into one or the other side. Despite every democratic state thinking or believing it is liberal, the reality is quite different. So my question is, exactly which type of democracy is journalism the oxygen of? When I began my first job ever, which was as a rookie reporter in the Fiji Times newsroom, the editor at that time, Vijendra Kumar, and some of you might remember him, echoed by senior journalist Robert Keith Reed, who was directly responsible for training me, taught me one thing, a lesson that I have never forgotten, and that is, whatever your personal, political, religious, ethnic, social, prejudicial, the list goes on, beliefs are, leave them at the door of the newsroom as you enter it every morning, just like taking off your shoes as you enter a house in Fiji. You are a reporter, nothing else. Your job is to report on things that happen to people, things and events they will not know about otherwise, and who read the newspaper or listen to the radio, or nowadays, of course, TV, watch TV, for exactly that. People do not care about your personal views. They just want the news. Your job is to give it to them without embellishments or bias. Well, it seems we have gone a long way from that. We're expecting journalists to take a stand about politics and political parties and about that slippery word democracy. I'd like someone to define democracy in a way that allows everyone to agree. Perhaps the American and the French revolutionaries were the closest to a common definition of democracy, but that was possibly the only thing that was relevant in the 17th century in opposition to feudalism in Europe. Many scholars, and indeed journalists, consider democracy to be the ideology of market forces that also exploits labor and facilitates a certain fraction of the population to remain in poverty and disadvantage. Greek scholars would say that democracy arose in ancient Greece as an attribute of the free elite. Slaves and women were not allowed in. Now we know that the world's media is big business. It is owned by big business. That must also not be forgotten. How do journalists navigate that fact of media ownership, which is actually the truth in Fiji and for Fiji as well as other places? I would also like someone to explain how in Fiji we are divided. Perhaps we are, but also perhaps we are more united as a society than many like to assume or promote. So, Professor George, and that is a tall order. I do hope that your keynote will take us beyond the current conundrum we are facing regarding the role of the media, and more importantly, the role of journalists. In our world, and the focus of our university, and the journalism and media program in particular, we teach that the role of reporters is to report, with facts and evidence, that's all. That is what we want as readers and listeners. We cannot burden journalists with anything else. Reporting is a huge responsibility already, not one that everyone can assume and undertake with professionalism and courage. It takes courage to report. It is the public's right to receive accurate information, and the media are endowed with the privilege and training, and we hope good training, to provide it. Accurate reporting is what our reporters should be trained for. While they must remain astutely aware of competing positions and interests among those whose stories that they are telling, they must never allow themselves to take sides. It is an element of trust and an obligation for reporters not to allow their own personal biases for or against any political system to intrude in their higher duty to the public. I hope, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, that Professor George's keynote today will allow everyone to reflect on these issues, as well as those that he will raise that are incredibly important to place in our own context. Vinaka.
As we proceed through our program, I now call upon Ratu Manwa Rokotavanga for the introduction of Professor Cherian George.
Repeating the words of welcome to each and every one of you. I would say that I have the most challenging task beforehand because I have to summarize the various accomplishments and the distinguished journey that this professor has had into a single, say, 2 to 3 minutes introduction, but I will try. Cherian George is a professor at the Hong Kong Baptist University School of Communication, where he also serves as a director of the Center for Media and Communication Research. His research interests center on freedom of expression in public life, especially in connection to media freedom, censorship, and religious intolerance. He has written multiple books, all of which have received acclaim and have also received top prestigious awards. He is also the author of several other books, which has been featured in Singapore and Southeast Asia. He also has visiting positions at the University of Hong Kong, Stanford University, and the University of Pennsylvania, where he was the inaugural Media at Risk Scholar at the Annenberg School in 2018. He won an academic writing residency at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center in Italy in 2011. Before joining academia, he was a journalist at the Straits Times. He continues to practice professional journalism as the editor and publisher of What's Up, which is an independent monthly current affairs newspaper for children, which was honored for editorial excellence by the Society of Publishers in Asia in 2006. He also holds various distinguished positions at various institutions, some of which include being an advisor in the London-based Ethical Journalism Network and the Singapore-based Asian Journalism Fellowship. And the other one is the juror for various international journalist awards, such as the Amnesty International's Human Rights Press Awards. He also takes a keen interest in media policy and reform, and has been actively engaged in forums on freedom of expression, including as a consultant for UNESCO and Freedom House. He received his PhD in communication from Stanford University. He has a master's from Columbia University School of Journalism and a bachelor's of arts in social sciences and political sciences from Cambridge University. He is an old boy of St. Andrews Junior and Secondary Schools and also Hawacho Junior College. He is married to Zuraida Ibrahim, a fellow journalist. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome the good professor.
So much to Dialogue Fiji and to the University of Fiji University for inviting me here today. Probably an overblown introduction, which makes me very worried that your expectations may be too high of this very humble scholar of a very, very complicated world. But I'm very reassured to have heard Professor Shamim's introduction, because that is exactly the spirit in which I would like to approach this topic. Indeed, it is far more complex than the simple slogans of role of media and democracy and so on suggest. Yeah? Like your school, my school as well, teaches what might be called the classic global approach to professional journalism, anchored in social responsibility, a belief that journalists operate through evidence, leave their values at the door. Journalism, in this professional sense, takes inspiration from the scientific method. Just as scientists may have their own personal values and views, their own religious beliefs about the origins of the earth and so on, they put these at the door and are guided by evidence. Similarly, professional journalism, which I think not coincidentally emerged shortly after the scientific revolution, has always tried to be evidence-based. With the additional pressure of having, of having to do it quickly, right? Scientists can take years, decades to come up to something approaching the truth. Journalists have to figure out what to say in the next few hours. And so all that journalists can do is to lead us closer to tomorrow than we were yesterday, with the full knowledge that the stories that we tell tomorrow will be incomplete and will probably need revision the day after tomorrow. That's all that journalists can do. So our approach to journalism education is very much as you've described what you do here today. The more complicated part is exactly what society should expect from media, in particular democracies that have very high expectations of the media. Again, I was slightly worried at the way in which this talk was built, because it suggests that I may come with answers. I do not come with answers. Right? The best I can do is to provide some lessons and context from the different countries that I've studied, from trends around the world, to help Fijians answer those questions for themselves. I think comparative studies have always attracted me, because on the one hand, context is extremely important. What works for one country may not work for another. What works for one city may not work for another. But often people overestimate how unique they are. There are, in fact, lessons that can be drawn from other people's experience. We make a mistake sometimes, though, as I will try to highlight in my talk, of over-focusing on some countries and ignoring others. I would say globally today, it would be a fair statement to say that even though there's a lot that non-liberal democracies can learn from liberal democracies, we know far too much about the US media and not enough about how other liberal democratic media work. And as I will show, there are models in parts of the liberal democratic world that may be far more relevant, may answer some of the questions that we have better than the rather unique idiosyncratic American model, which has dominated the discourse on press freedom. Yeah? So there is nothing that you can learn from Singapore, I have to tell you that. And in fact, over the last few days, I've had to apologize a number of times on behalf of my countrymen, because they tell me that a highly influential leader, probably the most powerful politician, or at least the second most powerful politician in your country over the last several years, in the last government, was a big fan of Singapore. Right? And I keep trying to tell them, well, I'm sorry. Right? I'm sorry that Singapore has inspired the wrong kind of leadership and values. And I was just sharing with my friends today, in fact, there's a good political science research to be done on all the suspect leaders around the world that have chosen to take inspiration from Singapore. So again, I have to apologize to all the people around the world that have suffered under leaders who are trying to copy Singapore's authoritarian ways. Yeah? We are not a model. Yeah? I had, in my very short stay in Suva, not even the rest of Fiji, I had a very fulfilling time this morning visiting Albert Park. It happened to be Civil Service Day. And the thing that struck me about the people visiting was that they were young, that although the Republic is old, almost as old as Singapore, in many ways Fiji feels young because, of course, you keep changing your system, right? Your constitution, the latest one, is quite new, and as has been made clear, there are many things about the system that you want that you haven't quite figured out yet. So it's a young country. In that sense, the system is young, but also the people are young, which then strikes me of what an important role universities have, journalists have, because the country is full of people like this, some of them not even yet of voting age, who depend on this generation and an older generation getting things right. Yeah? So it's such a heavy responsibility, and I salute those that are trying to be part of the solution, whether in journalism or in civil society or in universities. So this topic that Nilesh actually gave me, right, and I couldn't argue with it, it's a wonderful topic. The more I thought about it, the more I started to question it too, just like Professor Cherian. Yeah? First of all, democratic transitions kind of suggests that the rest of the world, or at least most of the world, is democratically stable. But over the last 10 years, we know, in fact, that democracies are characterized by instability. Most countries seem to be in transition either toward, but more commonly away from democracy. The last 15 years are known to political scientists as a time of democratic recession, a time of democratic decline. Several countries have moved from the liberal democratic category to something less than democratic. The US, of course, seemingly the champion of democracy, is now not regarded by most political scientists as a complete, stable, consolidated liberal democracy. It has structural failures. Yeah? So it's in transition too. Yeah? So I want to actually strike this out from the title, because it says nothing. Every country is in transition, mostly in the wrong direction. Divided societies. Fijians would like to think of themselves as a divided society. Singapore thinks of itself as certainly a multicultural society with deep racial, religious divisions. But we often exaggerate how homogeneous other countries are. Is there a homogeneous, undivided country in the world? No, of course not. There isn't. I mean, countries that seem ethnically homogeneous have other kinds of divisions. There are, of course, class divisions. Within those ethnic divisions, there are divisions of language, culture, and so on. Yeah? There is no society where everyone just gets along. So the question of how to cope with division too seems to be kind of redundant. All countries are divided. So we're left with the bigger question: what is the role of media? And that really is the way that I want to go with this. Let's start with what we think is the role of journalism. How do we even define journalism? It used to be quite unnecessary and obvious. People used to say that, well, it's obvious. Journalists are people who work for journalistic organizations. Yeah? That definition doesn't work anymore for a couple of reasons. On the one hand, you find individuals and small groups of individuals doing what can be called acts of journalism, but not working in journalistic organizations. In fact, there's great journalism being done not in news organizations. It was mentioned in the introduction that one of the things I do is I judge international journalism competitions. One of the most interesting trends in recent years is that extremely high quality journalism is coming from the NGO sector. They use journalistic methods, but they're not news organizations. In fact, this is where I would quibble with both the approach that your university takes and the approach that my university takes. Because these NGOs do not leave their values at the door. Right? For example, they're environmental NGOs who believe in saving the environment. There are NGOs dealing with human trafficking that are not at all neutral about human trafficking. The journalists working there are absolutely committed to solving those problems. But they use the journalistic method of gathering evidence to produce journalism in the areas they care about. So this is what we mean by acts of journalism in non-journalistic organizations. A very heartening trend. So this story that we hear, which is of course true, that news organizations are in decline, shrinking staff and so on, to some extent is being balanced, right? There's a counterweight, which is great acts of journalism taking place in non-journalistic organizations. Yeah? Because these NGOs, groups of citizens, realize that no, journalism is too precious, it's too important to leave to professional journalistic organizations. Yeah? The other reason why we can no longer define journalism as things that journalistic organizations do is that journalistic organizations, many of them, have always been, and one could say are increasingly corrupt in what they do. Right? You look at most news organizations in the world, except those that are of the highest quality, many of them are quite willing to sell their trade to the highest bidder through genres called content marketing or advertorials and so on. Yeah? The more honest ones will at least label that content as being sponsored. But many don't. Many will present stories as if those stories are done for the public interest, when in fact those stories are placed there to promote a brand. So a worryingly large proportion of content produced by supposedly journalistic organizations is actually advertising. So if you in fact have acts of journalism being done by non-journalists in non-news organizations and acts of propaganda and advertising being done in supposedly journalistic news organizations, then it's quite clear we can no longer define journalism as stuff that is produced by so-called journalistic organizations. So what's the definition? This is the definition that I use in my own teaching. I've tested it out around the world. I've never found a group of people who care about journalism who disagree with this, whether it's in China or in Hong Kong or in India or in Malaysia, Indonesia, the US, wherever, in Germany. Everyone's kind of, yeah, this kind of makes sense as a definition of journalism. So journalism is the reporting and commenting on current affairs. The first line is kind of obvious. It's the content or the what of journalism, right? What is the content of journalism? It's current affairs reporting and commentary. Through observation, investigation, and analysis, this is the how of journalism. Journalism is a method, right? It's a method of discovery. The most obvious, the earliest way to do it was to just go there and see what's happening, observation. But you ask questions as well, investigation. You explore the context. You try to make sense of it. You analyze. Yeah? So that's the how of journalism. So you've got the what and the how of journalism, but I would argue that you can't complete the definition without the why. Why are you doing it? Who are you doing it for? Right? And it's important to have the why question, because sometimes, and I gave you the example of content marketing, you see content that looks a lot like journalism. It's got a lead, it's got quotes, it's got a news point, right? It's presented just like a journalistic story, but it's actually meant to market a new restaurant or a new handphone model or new car model or whatever, right? It's paid for by a company that wants its product marketed. Yeah? So how do we distinguish journalism from that kind of stuff that is all too common? We need a why part of the definition. And my why is that journalism is content that helps people make sense of change and take part in public life. The make sense of change is the less controversial part of the definition. I think nobody in the world, I think not even any government in the world would disagree that this is something that journalists should do. The world changes in a way that ordinary people need information about, something as simple as the weather, something as more complex like geopolitical relations. People need to understand it. And so you need information that helps you make sense of all those changes, big and small. What about take part in public life? This, I guess, is the most normative or the most value-laden part of my definition. Yeah? Because it's making a big assumption. It is making a big assumption that no matter where in the world, because I aim this to be a universal definition, no matter where in the world you are today, it is a good thing for journalists to help people take part in public life. This is essentially a democratic assumption. That part of that definition would not have made sense in an earlier era where the role of the subject is simply to follow orders. Right? The role of the ruled is simply to be ruled by rulers who make decisions for them. So my contention is that no, universally, regardless of your political system, it is a good thing for journalists to help people take part in public life. Yeah? To have a say in the things that are happening around them. Okay? The interesting thing is that although I said that this is the most value-laden part of the definition, because it depends on certain democratic assumptions, that citizen participation is something good. I've not even met any Chinese journalists from mainland China operating under a communist system that disagrees with this. Right? It makes intuitive sense. It makes intuitive sense that yes, this is something journalists should do. Yeah? So this is not one of the things that Professor Shamim was referring to where you have to think about what kind of democracy. I would contend that this is universal. This is universal. Which is kind of good news because I think what we often overlook when we look at today's world. So I think that despite how much dispute there is between countries about and within countries as well, about the kind of democracy you want to be, right? There are countries like China where human rights is a dirty word. Yeah? Despite all that international contention and those differences of opinion, I'm going to stick my neck out and say that democracy and human rights have achieved what social scientists would call hegemonic status. It is the new common sense of today's world. Right? Which is, of course, not to say that democracy and human rights are respected everywhere. It is not to say that there aren't big debates about what exactly this means. All I'm saying is that there is no society in the world that does not kind of take it as common sense that people should have a say in how they are governed. That's the democratic part of it. Yeah? This is again very different from a century or two ago, but that was not the norm. The norm was we just took orders. Right? The norm is that there's a class of rulers and a class of ruled. That is no longer the common sense of today's world in anywhere in the world. So the The human rights part of this duality is a bit newer. It's also a radical change in the way people think about themselves and the world. The idea that wherever in the world you are not the property of your government. It is the government does not necessarily speak for you. Over and above what your rulers say, you have rights. Right? Everyone in the world has rights by virtue of the fact that you are a human being. A radically different way of thinking about relations in the world. Relatively new. Right? It is fully formed with the United Nations and the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And again, I want to emphasize that although, of course, there are many countries that don't respect human rights, the sense in which I will say that it is hegemonic, it is a new common sense, is that the onus is on those who disagree with human rights to defend their case, to explain why a group of person doesn't deserve human rights. This is radically new. It's wonderful. Right? Those who believe that everyone has equal human rights don't have to defend themselves anymore, because this is the content of the most part of the most significant treaties governing nations. Yeah? It is those who disagree that are on the defensive. Right? Journalism now operates in this context, where democracy and human rights, in this very broad sense, are hegemonic, are the new common sense. But like I said, of course, countries vary in terms of the way they actually run themselves. This is one way of classifying countries used by the Varieties of Democracy project. Professor Cherian used slightly different terms. I think this is the kind of a spectrum that most political scientists would use. Liberal democracy, not in the middle, but really at one end. Yeah, as representing the term that is used to describe countries that don't just have elections, but where there are strong checks against the abuse of power, even by elected governments. Right? And those strong checks are in the form of, I guess, first and foremost, strong independent courts, yeah, multi-party parliaments, the rule of law, but also free and fearless press. Yeah, that's how we would define liberal democracy. At the other end, closed autocracies, where all those checks and balances, including elections, are not found. And that would, of course, include China and a bunch of, it would include Vietnam, Laos, certainly the one-party communist states and so on, yeah? Most countries actually fall in this middle category, electoral democracies and electoral autocracies. Asia is full of electoral autocracies. An interesting term, they're called electoral because they do have elections. Different parties do take part, but but the vote is often either in some way corrupted by, for example, money, by fear, and more importantly, once governments get into power, there's very little check on what they're able to do. They're able to abuse people's rights with impunity. Yeah. In the worst cases, those are not even called democracies anymore. They're called autocracies that happen to have elections, right? Electoral autocracies. So I always have to correct my people from the land of my forefathers, India, who routinely will describe themselves as the world's largest democracy. India stopped being regarded as a democracy by political scientists a long time ago, right? Currently, India is classed as an electoral autocracy. They have elections. Elections are not meaningful because the power that people have to protect themselves from arbitrary violence, from violence by the state and non-state actors, the say that they have over government policy and so on is so limited that, yeah, okay, you have elections, but no, it doesn't, it no longer classifies as a democracy. Singapore has been an electoral autocracy for a long time. We're very familiar with that category. And the government is very proud of it. Yeah? We have a government that doesn't think much about democracy or human rights. As I said, many countries have moved leftwards, are in transition in the wrong way. These highlighted here are the countries that have autocratized, moved into the autocratic category in the 10 years between 2011 and 2021. So that's the state of the world that is kind of sobering to remember, even as we acknowledge that the principles of democracy and human rights have achieved a status higher than ever before in human history. Speaking of global varieties, it is important, I think, for those of us interested in media and communication to recognize that there are disagreements even within the liberal democratic camp in, I guess, overall subtle ways. They're not dramatic disagreements, but they're quite significant. And to simplify things, I guess I would contrast the US First Amendment tradition, which is quite idiosyncratic, quite unique, influential only in a small number of countries like the Philippines and Japan, that because they were once ruled by the Americans, and practically everyone else in the liberal democratic world, which do not follow the US First Amendment tradition, but what might be called the international human rights tradition. Yeah? It's important to, I think, for Fijians to know this, because, of course, you have big powers trying to, in a very well-meaning way, maybe not well-meaning, I don't know, overall well-meaning, to help your media, grow. I think it's important to understand that they come from a context that may actually have subtle differences in the way they think about media freedom. Yeah? So let me highlight what that difference is. As you know, the US First Amendment says this: Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Yeah? Congress shall make no law. It's been widened. It means that even state universities cannot control student publications. So any agent or institution of the public sector or the state cannot try to interfere in the media. Yeah? So not just the president and Congress, but even local government, even public universities. Right? The university president or chancellor cannot tell student media what to do, even if student media is completely funded by the university. Right? When I was at Stanford teaching 2 years ago, the Stanford student newspaper was in the middle of a controversy investigating plagiarism accusations against the president of Stanford. Right? And I asked the editor of the Stanford Daily News, do you fear that the faculty are going to, the university going to punish you for trying to bring down the president? He said, no, it never occurred to him. Never occurred to him. He is, of course, careful to make sure that he's not guilty of defamation, which is a legal thing, but he's not afraid of being punished by the university just because he's writing these reports about plagiarism by the university president. And they won, by the way. The university president had to resign. Yeah? So that's how strong the US First Amendment is. Okay? Which is why, of course, it is a very inspiring document and so on. What does the international human rights tradition say? The source is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 19. I assume Fiji is a signatory of the ICCPR. The European Charter in Article 10 has almost identical words. And I just last night checked the Fiji Constitution, Article 17. The words are practically identical. Yeah? So this is a far more common way of in which democracies or would-be democracies think about free speech. Yeah? Both are strongly protective of free speech. They are different in two significant aspects. The First Amendment ends there. The Article 19, I haven't shown you the rest, is followed by a big but. Right? There's a but. And the but is that, given the fact that speech is a social value, governments can, in certain cases, restrict free speech. Yeah? The other significant difference is this. There's one word here that doesn't appear in the US First Amendment, and that's the word receive. This, the but part of Article 19, which I haven't shown, most people say, well, that makes the international human rights tradition weaker than the First Amendment tradition. But the word receive makes the ICCPR, and including the Fijian Constitution, much more powerful than the US Constitution. Why? Earlier we heard about how, well, media are in theory supposed to serve the public, but not necessarily so, right? They can be big business, they could be doing it for themselves, right? In US First Amendment context, there's no obligation for the US to serve the public. They could just be serving their owners, right? Because Americans, by Constitution, have no right to receive good information. The international human rights tradition, in contrast, says that all of us have the right to receive the information and ideas that we need to function in a democracy. Yeah? Why is this significant in terms of policy? It explains why practically all European liberal democracies, as well as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, have this institution called independent public service media. Right? You can think of independent public service media like the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and so on as direct outcomes of their country's recognition that people have a right to receive information. And since the private sector cannot be counted on fully to provide the kind of information and ideas that people need, there needs to be some kind of public investment in media. Yeah? The Americans take a dramatically different position. They're extremely frightened of public funding in media. The only publicly funded media that Americans have is Voice of America, yeah, which by law can only go out of America, right? Voice of America is prohibited from broadcasting to Americans, although of course now it's impossible to control because of the internet, right? Voice of America cannot broadcast to Americans because the government is supposed to not interfere in the domestic media. Yeah? So the Europeans, and to me a much more sensible view, is the international human rights view that says, no, in fact the state has an obligation to make sure that its people are well informed. Then of course you have the challenge of making sure that the public service media, even though funded by the state, remains independent of the government. Yeah? Americans find that concept very confusing. They say, well, it's not possible. How can you have government funding and independence from government? My Chinese students also find it very confusing. How can you have government supporting media and it not be propaganda? But experience has shown, in the case of the BBC and similar institutions, that yes, you can. You can, in fact, structure the organization in a way such that the Prime Minister cannot order the BBC what to do. You can only affect its funding over the long term if you don't like the BBC, right? But it would be unthinkable for a Prime Minister in Britain to pick up the phone and say they're unhappy with the story and they want a more pro-government story tomorrow. I have not had time to look at how public service media is run in Fiji, yeah? But I would say be careful about, if for example it is not being run very well, I would be careful about coming to the American conclusion that the solution is to privatize all media, get rid of public funded media. No, I think the solution is we've got to recognize that the market does not do public interest journalism very well, and we need, in fact, public funding for media. And then the policy challenge is how to make sure that that publicly funded media is strongly independent from politicians. So my interest has always been more in how we can make sure that the media system as a whole is robust, rather than deal with the faults and weaknesses or strengths of individual media organizations. By and large, if you take a step out and ask what kind of media system a country needs, UNESCO has been using these terms for a couple of decades, and I think they're very, very useful terms to keep in mind, right, when we're trying to shape our media environment. So UNESCO believes, to be consistent with Article 19 of the ICCPR, we need, number one, media that are free, very easy to understand, right? Free from government control. But that's not enough. UNESCO says that it's not enough for media to be free. Media professionals need to be independent, right? Including independent from the owners of media businesses. Yeah? This is a problem the world over, that where media owners exert undue pressure on journalists. The American way of thinking is that, well, that's fine, because after all, they are media owners. But you've got to understand the political bias that leads them to this conclusion. The political bias is that Americans treat property rights as very sacred. Yeah? So the idea that anyone should have a right to tell a media owner what to do sounds very sacrilegious to them. Yeah? After all, it's their property. And this is, again, is one of the interesting debates within the liberal democratic family. The counter to that argument is that no, ultimately media is a public service, is a public resource, and even media owners have obligations to the public. It is not so unthinkable if you say compare with other professions, right? If you think of journalism as a profession dedicated to a public service, there are other professions dedicated as a public service. How are they organized? Would you find it acceptable, for example, if doctors, when treating you, listened to their managers and their accountants about the best course of action for you, right? And recommended treatments and surgeries to help the hospital's bottom line? Right? It'd be outrageous. It'd be outrageous. And nobody would say, well, yeah, fair enough. After all, these guys own the hospital. Fair enough. I mean, nobody's going to think that. They say, no, of course. Regardless of who owns the hospital, the professional duty of the doctor is to serve the patient. Yeah? And we have to make sure that the hospital is organized in such a way that doctors have enough professional integrity and independence to do the right thing for their patients, irrespective of what their investors want. Yeah? Common sense. Other professions work that way too. Engineers don't sign off, or I hope, right? Don't sign off on drawings about building bridges or buildings based on the bottom line of their construction companies. No, they have a professional obligation that when they sign on a blueprint, it is because they have tested it and they know this bridge is not going to fall down. Right? And no matter how much pressure there is from management saying, oh, wait, just pass it through, right? I understand that this tall hotel nearby has had some of those issues, right? Possibly unsafe and so on. It would be a bit of a worry, right? If the owners had a say rather than regulators. And I think we need to think of journalism the same way, right? Journalists need to be protected even from their managers and owners, so that they can do the right thing for the public. Yeah, and this goes back to my definition of journalism, that it is ultimately a public service. Yeah? So that's independence. Plural, another vitally important term when we're trying to think of the kind of media that we want. It's not enough to be free and independent. We need media to be plural. And this goes back to one of my first points, that diversity is not a rare thing, which is exactly why UNESCO, when describing the kind of media systems that all countries need, has the idea of plural media, because UNESCO recognizes that in every society there's diversity, right? And if you don't keep your eye on this ball, right, what's likely going to happen is that you're going to have media that serve certain communities better than other communities, right? Even if they're free and independent, often for economic reasons, you're likely to find certain communities underserved, either because they're too small, they use minority languages, they're too poor for advertisers to be interested in. Yeah? And that is not a healthy media system. If in fact your media, for example, are mostly serving urban audiences and rural audiences are not even there. Their voices are not reflected. Yeah? So whatever the media system that Fiji decides on and builds, I hope you think in these systemic terms. It's not so much whether the Fiji Times is doing a good job or Fiji Sun is doing a good job, but overall, in terms of the different media organizations, and not just media organizations, but also NGOs, independent media, blogs, yeah, YouTube channels, collectively are they delivering all these things? Right? Different kinds of media do this better than other kinds of media. Usually profit-seeking, privately owned media tend to do media freedom well. They don't necessarily do media independence well, for which you probably need a strong media profession and strong independent public service media. Often neither of them do plurality well. But I have to say that if you look at, say, Australia's SBS as an example, that shows a commitment to plurality, yeah? Where the state invests in multiple language services. Plurality is one thing that the internet excels in, because you can have community media, community radio, and so on to fill that gap. Yeah? So I would urge you, not just as journalists, but just as citizens, to keep an eye on these barometers. How well is Fiji doing on all these scores, which would help you move to a healthier media system. Let me actually end there and take some questions, because I'd like to be guided. Maybe the rest of the conversation can be guided by your interests and remarks.
Thank you, Professor George. I would call upon Manwa to assist in moderating the questions. In the essence of time, ladies and gentlemen, please be succinct with your question. As the good professor had said, he doesn't have the answer, but he'll probably give you a way out somehow.
Thank you. Even though I don't have the answer, I talk a lot, as you notice.
Well, thank you, Professor, for that very enlightening lecture. And also, I believe the insights that you provided, especially on the role media plays in the intersectionality of media and democracy, has given a lot of information for us to think about. We will now formally transition into our question and answer session. I do encourage you, if you have any questions, I encourage you to raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone over and we'll pose it to the good professor, who will then deliver an answer for you.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. It's a wonderful lecture. I'm Professor Shaukat Ali from the University of Fiji. My area is not journalism. I'm pure IT guy. Very interesting lecture you have delivered today. I would like to say thank you on behalf of my department. When my one eye is blind, I am not worried. I lost one hand, I am not worried. But if something happened in my brain, I'm really worried. The thing you told, majority of the journalists are corrupted. It's a really worry message for us, I accept. However, as I mentioned, I am an IT guy. What do you think the transition we are looking for from human journalism to AI-based journalism, where biasness is less, but in Fiji we are not ready at all? What do you think? How should we welcome this transition from human journalism to AI-based journalism? Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, that's something that my department and other journalism departments are treating very seriously. We're asking those questions too. Yeah. In general, I think if there is a consensus, let me address the point from the perspective of the industry, but also the wider society. Yeah. So from the industry's perspective, I think based on various conferences and so on that the media are organizing to try and figure out this issue, the general view is that number one, it's unavoidable, right? That like all technologies, if it is going to be too attractive to resist, to use these technologies to make companies more efficient. Yeah. Let me give you an example of how this can actually be very, very wonderful as a way to AI-assisted journalism can be quite wonderful as a way to improve journalism, and I think nobody would deny that this is an improvement. Translation, right? If AI improves the quality of translation, imagine the power for journalism and for education as well. That you can much more easily roll out, one person does the writing, a reliable translation of it into multiple regional languages, yeah, in a way that was never possible before. Wonderful, yeah. But there are also worries about how what may actually happen, and we know from the rollout of past technologies that often the use of the technologies will not be led by the professionals nor by the public, but by techies and by accountants using the techies, right? And therefore, and the thing that I think journalists fear most is AI being used to replace more costly manpower, even though the AI cannot do as good a job. Yeah, that it will result in companies choosing AI tools just to save money, even though it's quite clear that it is not up to the task. Right? Even though AI is not ready to do many things, they will use it as an excuse that okay, let's cut 1/3 of our manpower and substitute it with AI. There are things that only human beings can do and ever will be able to do, right? And this may be hurtful to the techies, right? But I'm sure you would agree that, remember the first thing that I mentioned in my definition of the methodologies of journalism is observation, right? I haven't seen any predictions on the AI side, even the most optimistic side, that tell us that we are anywhere near to, if for example there's a disaster, a hurricane or something, yeah, you can send a drone, yeah, but are we near to sending a robot there to figure out how people are actually coping? And are we near to sending a robot to ask how people are suffering, who needs help and how much help? I doubt it, right? I haven't seen any predictions that say that the AI will be sophisticated enough to do that. Sure, you can grab certain images from a disaster scene, but the drone may be able to detect that 10 bodies, or things that look like bodies, right, were transported away in 5 ambulances. The drone will not be able to ask the medical staff on the ground what the status is of those 10 bodies. How many dead, how many seriously injured, how many just superficial wounds. The drone cannot do that. AI cannot do that. Even if there was a robot sophisticated enough to do that, is the medical personnel, remember, we're talking about disaster here, right? In the rush of doing all this thing, going to spend time talking to a robot? No. But a journalist that is trusted in that community, trusted by the police and medical workers because that journalist is based there, a familiar face, can get answers. Community leaders, families will tell their stories to a human being in a way that I don't think they're going to tell a robot. So the basic journalistic function of being there, observing, having enough empathy to know who to talk to and who not to talk to, right? Some people need to be left alone, grieve. Yeah, some people in the same sea of people you can interview. I'm sure you would agree AI is nowhere near making those real-time decisions on who to interview and how. Yeah? But my fear, like I said, is that the accountants will say, no, all this can be done by AI, and you cut staff and replaced by robots, which will produce content, sure, but it is unlikely to be high-quality content that people actually need.
Thank you, Professor George, for your very interesting presentation. I'm Aman Nath, and I'm the Democracy and Governance Specialist with the USAID. 2 quick questions. One is that considering Fiji's history of ethnic turmoil and coups, the kind of journalism models that we have, festival journalism, free speech, free journalistic practices, festival journalism versus development journalism. But development journalism, peace journalism, but state agencies like the media houses can become effective agents of state propaganda. Do you think, from your take, which approach, which ground should PG undertake? Whether the festival journalism versus the peace journalism, or it should take a middle path or middle approach. The first question. Second one is basically a short comment on VTEM democracy, that you had highlighted. The research carried out by VTEM Institute of Democracy, that is based in Sweden, that highlights the democratic backsliding in countries like India and the United States. There are also, I respect that there are methodologies and algorithms that these institutions have. But on the other hand, these countries, like for example, there have been also been criticisms of VTEM as well. For example, countries like Nepal and Kosovo are placed above India in democratic rankings, which is questionable. These countries have strong institutions, democratic culture, strong civil society, and a range of robust institutions to safeguard. Because these countries, some of the recent countries, for example, US has been there, but India and other countries, they have become successful democracies because by virtue of the constitutions restrain the power of the state. The state has been restrained. That is why they have been able to become successful democracies. Yes, they are not perfect, but at least the power of the state has been restrained. So,
sorry, referring to which countries?
For example, US and India, these are countries, because the power of the state has been restrained. So it just falls into question, the effectiveness, how genuine, the VTEM, institute, So just on this.
Sure.
Thank you.
On the first point, yes, there's been a historic debate about what's called development journalism. It started out, that whole movement, with the best of intentions. The problem was that So what was good about the development journalism movement was it reminded journalists that in less developed countries, there are priorities, very basic priorities that journalists shouldn't ignore, right? And should actually think of themselves as a partner of development. Let's get our priorities right. So what I think is valuable in the development journalism tradition is the reminder to us that we must set our own priorities, right? Based on our understanding of our society. Where the development journalism movement lost a lot of prestige and points is that it was often used by governments to say that since we are the lead development agency, the role of the press is therefore to partner us. And this was often an excuse for censorship. Yeah? Which I think is still a serious problem. Governments often use that excuse. We are working for the benefit of our country. We are helping develop our country. If you are interested in development, stop criticizing us and partner us. No. I don't buy that. Yeah? And by the way, it's not just developing or less developed countries that are concerned about development, right? Many of these issues apply in the richest countries too. So in the US, I would invite you to look at the solutions journalism movement. When you think about it, actually there's similarities to development journalism. The solutions journalism movement tells journalists that, look, you got to understand the real priorities of your community, your small town, your society, and they may actually be struggling with failing schools, with unsafe water supply, really development issues, right? Don't just think about satisfying your rich readers. Think about the real needs of your, the day-to-day needs of your community. Serve those needs. Yeah. So I think there's certainly wisdom in that. But how do you do it? Do you do it by surrendering your freedom and independence to the government just because they happen to have a ministry in charge of development or whatever? No, I don't think you're serving your society well that way. Because no matter how good that agency is, there's always benefit to having independent scrutiny. And that independent scrutiny should be there from the press. I would agree, though, that sometimes the media can be too adversarial, right? The point is not to oppose the government in a knee-jerk way, no matter what the government is doing. The point is to understand people's needs and make up your own assessment. To what extent is this new program actually helping people on the ground? Has there been enough consultation and participation? If there has, maybe this is in fact a program or policy that you can help explain to the public to ensure it's a success. Right? But again, you don't switch off your mental faculties, right? You still, of course, your role is to see what are the possible improvements and so on. But as you know, sometimes, as every country knows, sometimes things are done that look good on paper for the government. This is a so-called development program, but actually it is there to enrich local elites. Actually, there's lots of corruption. Are you going to say, well, since the development program, I pretend not to see anything? Of course not. Right? You have to independently scrutinize. On your second point, sure, that it is always easy to nitpick at the methodology of any one way of assessing democracy. But what if multiple different methodologies and different assessors come up with the same conclusions? And most have tracked, even though they use different methods, have all concluded that India is no longer a democracy. Have all concluded that the US has backslid from being a liberal democracy and does not deserve to be even in the top 20 or 30 countries ranked by press freedom or democracy. If multiple agencies are saying the same thing, then, well, maybe they have a point. Maybe they have a point. Yeah?
Thank you, Professor. Yep, at the back there.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Matai. I'm a part-time lecturer here at University of Fiji. My question is, you picked on the Constitution and Section 17, subsection 3 and H. I just wanted to pick your brains on this. It reads, because our media decree has been repealed, but in the Constitution it still has making provisions for the enforcement of media standards and providing for the regulation, registration, and conduct of media organizations. So, is the government, government in power still has the power to set up, organizations such as the media authority.
Right.
I know that Singapore has a media authority as well. So what's your take on this 17.3H? Thank you.
Okay, so if I hear you correctly, 17.3H, is it?
Yeah.
Allows for registration and setting standards and so on. So all I'll say is that is not consistent with ICCPR Article 19. Yeah. So multiple UN experts and investigations and so on find that licensing and registration systems are not compatible with freedom of expression. And I guess that comes later, does it? So the first part sounds very similar to Article 19, and then in the fine print they have sneaked in these very naughty provisions. Right. So certainly I would put that on the list of reforms that need to be made. Yeah. If you want to be consistent with international human rights norms, because in general, although it is a good thing for media to be regulated, the consensus is that self-regulation is better than state regulation, and state regulation is reserved for only the most extreme faults. In particular, where media rights are being exercised in a way that violate other people's rights. Yeah? The state should not regulate the media to kind of uphold some kind of standard of quality that the state has. That's very, very dangerous.
Good afternoon, Professor George. My name is Vijay Narai. I'm the news director for Fiji Village and also part-time lecturer at Uni Fiji and executive committee member of Fiji Media Association. Interesting discussions, and I was in the Pacific Editors panel earlier today at Holiday Inn. Raised some issues about Fijian media, where we have come from and a lot of work that's still left to be done. And when we went to Australia a few years ago, and even ABC didn't know that that in Fiji we do not have a law passed by Parliament that government can give money to free media, to India public service media, but it cannot have any interference.
So there is or isn't that law?
In Australia, there is a law. Yeah. In Fiji, there's none.
Right.
They were shocked. So what we're trying to advocate for is that this government should make things right. If money is allocated to any media, that there should be no interference, right. No strings attached, because there's a lot of things that have happened, which includes the Walesi setup, where the transmission is all controlled by the media and by the government, and the TV broadcasters are all on one transmitter site. And we were being forced to go on it, but when we opposed it, we were seen as media that is supporting the opposition. So I'm asking you, do you know of any lobby groups and other contexts that we as the Fiji Media Association can work with to look at all these proposed reforms which are necessary for free and independent media?
Right. Are you referring in particular to public-funded media?
Public-funded media and the laws that need to be reformed.
Right.
Because there's still some of the laws that still have various restrictions for the media.
Right, right. So it sounds like the Constitution is going to be tough to amend, right? But I suppose even if the Constitution allows the government to do these things like licensing journalists and so on, if you successfully change the norms in your society to make that politically unacceptable, even though they are allowed to do it, they won't do it in an ideal situation, right? And that's where you need public support. You need the public to understand that the licensing and registration of individual journalists is something that only very, very few and highly autocratic societies do. Even Singapore doesn't do it, and Singapore is highly authoritarian. Yeah. You also need, I think, to help educate the public that publicly funded but independent media is a worthy goal and an important goal. And there's a lot of lobbying of that sort that needs to be done to convince your fellow citizens that, and this is difficult in the current age because I'm sure in Fiji, like in most countries, most citizens are under the illusion that since they have so much information on the internet, they're fine, right? I know a lot of countries, including my own in Singapore, where people feel they don't even need to invest in journalism because after all, the internet tells them everything, right? And so that is quite a hard sell. You need to somehow convince your fellow citizens, universities I think have a big role here too, that no, people commenting on the internet is not the same as journalism, right? You cannot just rely on people who have a view without actually having sat through a long parliament session or gone to a press conference and asked tough questions. These things take time, discipline, and so on, right? You need a professional corps of journalists who can invest their time and be the public's representative in all these different settings. You need the professional journalists to go to a disaster zone because your ordinary citizen is not going to go and find out for themselves. And if the market cannot support it, it is good that there's public support, public funding support. As for who can, international lobby groups, the only one that I know of is something called the Public Service Media Alliance. I've not personally been in touch with them. They are mostly a network of the likes of the BBC and so on, right? So they are an alliance of public service broadcasters in liberal democracies, and perhaps they could be a resource because, of course, they've got lots of experience in dealing with these policy issues as well as public education issues. It is, I think, in general, a tough time to persuade citizens that this is actually a very important limb in your media system. But I'm convinced that it is necessary because it is quite clear that public interest journalism, in other words, journalism that serves the public rather than just teaches us how to be better consumers, is what economists call a market failure. Right? The market will not be able to provide enough quantity and quality of news that people actually need to be good citizens. There needs to be public funding for this.
Based on the money it's giving to the media organization.
Oh, including advertising.
No, it gives money as public service funds.
To different media?
One specific media organization.
State-owned media. Yeah. So that so basically what you're saying.
What we have, what's missing is there's no law.
Sure. So
stop
you
the
need to lobby for that.
interference.
You do need to lobby for that. You need people to understand that there's a big difference between government media, which is what China has, what Singapore has, where government gives the money but can also influence them, and public service media, where the state gives the money but government is not allowed to influence them. Right? People need to understand that there's a difference, and if there is enough consensus in among voters and the public that in fact they do not want government to have the ability to interfere with media that they fund, then either by law or by practice you can achieve it. So let me give you an example of Hong Kong. where for decades, even though there wasn't a law like this, the government didn't interfere because it would have been politically unacceptable to interfere. So you can achieve your goal in two ways, and ideally both ways. You can have legal protection, but you can also have protection that comes from changing the norms, right? If most citizens, and including the elites, recognize that it is politically unacceptable for any government to tell public service media what to do when they pay them, then they won't do it. Just like the Hong Kong government for decades didn't do it because it was just politically unacceptable, even though legally they could. Yeah. So this involves public education. Ideally, of course, you will also have a law to protect that media.
Thank you, Professor. We'll have time for just two more questions, two last questions. One to the gentleman in blue and to yourself.
Well,
Someone here as well.
thank you, Professor. I just wanted to suggest to Vijay there's another organization called IFEX, the International Freedom of Expression Network globally. I was a member of the council, so because it's talking about states that are coming out of restrictive type of political setups into democracy as well. So that could be another suggestion for the Fiji Media Council.
Hello. Okay, my name is Ashish. Very interesting. I'm just enjoying. I was a journalist a long way back. Just briefly, I have a comment. It's not really a question. When you watch BBC News, we need to receive a lot of right information, but especially the weather news. When it goes to the Pacific Islands, it doesn't mention about Pacific Islands. It stops where New Zealand is. That's it. That's just my observation. And maybe we can, as media people, we raise it with BBC. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe with
Thank you. I, for a moment, thought I had escaped your notice. Thank you for the opportunity. And thank you, Professor. There's been some interesting questions raised on the floor this afternoon. Thank Vijay Narayan, my colleague, for bringing some of them up. By way of introduction, I'm Richard Naidu, editor of Islands Business Magazine, which looks at issues across the Pacific, based out of here in Suva. Some thoughts from a point of view of practice in terms of day-to-day journalism, and especially the question of or the issue of integrity of practice in times of pressure, with some of the events that are known to have happened in Fiji across the last 3 or 4 decades or so. And if I may revisit your theme, Professor, which you sort of dissected earlier on in your presentation. And with due respect, could I just say that, if I may revisit that by saying that my sense of today's theme comes from maybe partly a place in the Fijian context where extra political events such as takeovers and overthrows of elected governments have oftentimes placed us or thrust us into a place of sudden and extraordinary change. The pressures that those events and circumstances place on the element of making sense of events which is part of your definition of journalism, not just place pressures on them, but under duress and because of those challenges, even left by the wayside. So my question is, what are some of the things that you might think of pointing us to in terms of signposts or guidelines that might be able to help us retain or even protect that sense of integrity in our day-to-day practice of journalism during those times, and not just in those times in particular, but in the aftermath of coming out of those times to continue to make sense of those prolonged periods, years, even decades of change politically, in terms of electoral systems, constitutionally, etc., as we've been discussing this afternoon. How important are those? What are some of the things that we can hold on to? What are some of the maybe industrial structures of frameworks that we can adopt and own so that those elements of practice in terms of making sense are maintained for the good of the public interest that we are ultimately supposed to be serving? Thank you.
I mean, a wonderful question, a great question to end on. Frankly, I don't think the wisdom or the knowledge lies in academia. I think it lies in the lived experience of professionals like yourself, not just in Fiji, but in the many other settings where things get disrupted in a very bad way, yeah? And suddenly you find the rug being pulled from under your feet. What do, right? I mean, of course, in extreme situations, if some utter totalitarian evil leader comes into power and thinks nothing of killing people, there's nothing you can do, right? In most situations, though, I think of autocratization, things are not quite so extreme, and they often takes a longer time. There may be ways to make yourself more resilient. Let me just mention a couple. One is, what can media organizations do? Yeah, against what some people call media capture. Yeah? Media is supposed to be independent, but autocratizing regimes often find ways to capture the media, often through economic means, right? And they do it often not by threatening the journalists on the ground, but by co-opting the top leadership, the owners, directors, and so on, yeah, through economic carrots. That's one of the most common ways in which autocratizing regimes around the world have tamed their big media. It's the Philippines, India, Turkey, a number of countries have done the same thing. They have turned big media into their champions, into their vehicles through ownership takeovers or by dangling carrots to their owners, and you win over the media that way. Yeah? What is the best formula? I assume you're laughing because it's relevant to Fiji as well. Is that why? Is it too close to home? Well, I'm not referring, I know nothing about how it's done in Fiji. I just know it's a very common technique around the world. Probably, I would say, the most common way in which media are captured. How can it defend against that? Very difficult. But, and this is why I say media independence is so important. That concept of media independence is so important and underutilized, right? Don't let yourself fall into this trap of thinking that, oh, it's the media owner that has rights, or that press freedom belongs to media owners. No, press freedom belongs to the public. Press freedom belongs to the public, right? And the owner can be a threat to press freedom. Just because the owner is happy and rich does not mean that press freedom is alive and well, right? How do you protect against it? There are interesting ways. This has to be done long before there's a threat. The most interesting formula that I've not had enough time to study is something that apparently is common in the Nordic countries. So if you have aid agencies from Sweden and so on, you can ask them how they do it, right? In, I think, Denmark, Netherlands, and so on, it is pretty common for there to be treaties within the company guaranteeing editorial independence. So the owner signs a treaty with the staff. Right? The owner signs an agreement guaranteeing editorial independence of the editors. If you have those kinds of agreements and treaties, contracts in place, it makes it just a bit harder for media capture to take place. Right? Because the owner can then turn to the person who's trying to buy him over and say, well, yeah, you can bribe me, but ultimately I actually don't have a say over the way my newsroom operates. I don't have a say. Yeah? And I think this is an interesting formula that has been not used enough. Internal agreements between staff and owners. The other thing that I've seen that applies more to, not to big media journalists, but the media profession as a whole, including independent journalists, is, you need to think, okay, in the bad times, how do you, and it may be true that during the bad times, there's actually nothing you can do. All you can do is hope and pray for times to get better. Right? That's all you can do, realistically. So what can you do in the meantime? In the meantime, if you think ahead, when opportunities resurface, ideally, that core of talent of journalists is still there to re-emerge. They haven't all migrated to Australia, right? They haven't all become PR professionals or working for government, or even if they are becoming PR professionals to make ends meet in the short term, they still preserve that fire inside. Yeah? So there are countries, and this happened in Indonesia during the worst days of President Suharto 30 years ago, yeah? When newspapers were being banned and so on. There was a core of very principled journalists who went underground and never gave up. Right? So they went underground, they organized, they could not actually practice independent journalism, but they were preparing for the day when they could. Right? And they sustained each other. They made sure that they had jobs in the creative industry, they kept their professional training alive, even if it was doing corporate work and so on. Yeah? So that when the day comes that Indonesia is free again, they suddenly resurface. That's exactly what happened in Indonesia. One of the most inspiring stories from this region, which again you won't hear if you're just paying attention to news from Australia and New Zealand and so on. Your other neighbor, Indonesia, an amazing story of when Suharto fell, how the profession immediately revived. It wasn't an accident. They had been prepared for that day. Right? So when they had a new government that came in after Suharto and was scratching its head and saying, okay, what kind of press law do we need? This group of senior journalists actually had an answer. Right? They said, okay, now that you asked us, this is the press law that we need. This is the system that we need. And they grabbed it, and as a result, Indonesia has probably one of the best press laws in Asia. Yeah? Not an accident. Journalists sustaining themselves in bad times so that when times become better, they resurface. So that is at the professional end rather than organizational end. Yes.
Thank you, Professor. We'll wrap up the Q&A.
So, come back.
If I could, pardon me, but if I could just ask a very quick supplementary question to that. Excuse me, to just bring things very close to the Fijian home context. But we have a variety of ethnic groups in Fiji, and a lot of the turmoil and problems that we've had politically over the years have been around those issues. And so naturally, during times of crisis and problems, that creeps naturally into the practice of journalism, where subjective biases and predispositions come into play. Now, how would you? I'm just curious as to how you would speak to that, and what coming back to.
It's so important. A couple of minutes, if you don't
integrity
mind.
Of practice.
Yeah, I understand it's a huge problem, and of course that was the diversity part of the question that I kind of ignored because it's universal. But fortunately, because it's universal, there is wisdom out there that you can tap. The most obvious would be ethical codes that exist all around the world about how to deal with diversity. Including how to avoid stereotyping. There is a lot of resources on how to report religion responsibly that I think are also relevant for race. So, for example, one of the lessons, one of the guidances that is given from religious reporting is that always try to understand what is the agenda of different people. Don't assume that leaders speak for their communities. Right? Don't make the mistake of thinking that the most extreme voices are the most representative voices. A very common mistake among journalists. Right? Because the most extreme voices are always more newsworthy because they're sexier. More moderate but more representative voices sound relatively boring. Right? So this wisdom is out there, and I think it's up to journalists to internalize it for the kinds of situation that you describe, right? Always ask, and this is where I think it is not about, adopting a new model of journalism like development journalism. No, it's actually just about being a better journalist, right? You hear a leader make certain claims supposedly on their behalf of their community, right? You should be a good enough journalist to say, wait, is he really speaking on behalf of his community? What is his real agenda? Is this just a power grab? How representative is he? Right? Maybe I should go to the ground and talk to ordinary people. Do they all really back him? Yeah? And that allows you to then report the hate speech, report these conflicts in context. Yeah? And I think that would be the most powerful thing that journalists can do. Don't be misled by leaders who use race and religion for their own political agendas. And you can do this by just being better journalists. Look for more voices. Don't be distracted by the brightest or noisiest voice in the room. Okay. There's one more, but I think we better, for the sake of the audience. Okay, sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
I'm from PNG. And I will talk from two perspectives, and at the same time, I'm a school teacher. The different kinds of rights. One of them is the child right in relation to school and so forth. My first one observation is that when the child rights are sometimes weaponized, meaning democracy provided child rights or different rights along the line. And that's one side of the story. Now I want to look at it from a PNG political settings against communication. Sometimes the member of the parliament or politicians, they think that the people are speaking against them, the media has been bought off by another opposite group and so forth. So those are realities with real situations. The professionalism is there at the same time to have ethical issues. My suggestion, the rights should go with responsibility. And I believe that the rights should be also protected by the democracy. Because these two are sometimes playing in between with no parameters or no, just open, like a loose bearing in a wheel of a car. So this situation creates very unsafe social circumstances, and the cohesiveness is not there. So I believe that probably whatever that should come together as a community, and we should say that these are the guidelines that we should operate under, so that everybody is guided, whether it's that the rights should go with responsibility. I believe that is sometimes, remember the child right or media right, whatever the woman right, is more powerful than influence the nation. And we can also build the nation or break the nation. And then in there you see people trying to operate. So I believe that there is a situation where my point is, can there be some parameters drawn as to how far every actor can operate responsibly so that there is a social cohesion?
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. No, I think that's a great question to end on because it highlights the difference between freedom of expression and press freedom. Yeah. And I think there is actually a difference, and it boils down to what you said about responsibility. So about 100 years ago, when the Americans were trying to deal with this institution of sort of overpowerful media, many wise thinkers came together, came up with a document called a Free and Responsible Press, which is still used in teaching. I use it in my own teaching. And it points out that, and I like this line in that document, it says, the press must be free from government to serve the public. Right? Free from government to serve the public. And the to serve the public part is exactly the responsibility of the press. Which is very different from, say, artistic freedom, where, you have artistic freedom maybe just to satisfy yourself, right? To express your own inner urges or whatever. But that's not what press freedom is. You're free from government control for a purpose, to serve the public. This, of course, is something, responsibility, almost by definition, is something that you can only exercise when you're free. If you have no freedom, there's no need or no space to exercise responsibility, right? So I think it's important to clarify, because sometimes I hear this even from my own readers and my leaders in Singapore. Oh, the press must be responsible. What they actually mean is that the press must be under their control. Yeah? But no, if the press is under your control, you can't exercise responsibility. You have no agency to exercise responsibility. So the responsibility part needs to be something that is worked out within the profession and with the public, right? Not with government. Of course, government can have a say and can influence the conversation, but it shouldn't be constrained by powerful forces. So thank you very much for this conversation and for the wonderful questions as well. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm not giving the vote of thanks. That's a wonderful friend, Nilesh here. But I wanted to thank you, Sir Professor, most sincerely for coming to give this not just a public lecture, which is very, very enlightening, but also to allow the people in the audience who actually I didn't realize were world-famous journalists themselves, that we've had to rely on for our news for such a long time in very difficult circumstances. What you have brought out today, from not just as a journalist from the journalistic point of view and from the news point of view, but from an academic point of view, an intellectual point of view, is the fact that we have not had the opportunity to discuss all of the points for a very long time that you've just raised. It's one thing to have, our journalism and media program, and we deliberately went out to get the journalists that we knew were reputable and highly respected in the community to come and teach in the program, but that's confined to the university space. It's not public by any means. But the things that you have actually brought out, and there's so many, it's impossible to do justice to them in the one session. But the things that you've brought out would rightly belong, and this is kind of a challenge to all of us really to do it, in what I used to remember quite vividly when I was a young journalist, in a press club. We have not had a press club in this country for a very long time. Not the same as the Media Council. The Media Council has got a specific role. It takes complaints. It does other things as well. It kind of like, it's an important group and a lobby group at that. But a press club is where, and it has a space. We used to meet at the club hotel, because journalists are known for drinking a lot. Alcohol.
Maybe the university can sponsor.
Well, I was coming to that. We just not so much sponsor, but because you see there's things to do with sponsorship. But we can certainly, and I'm hoping that Dialogue Fiji will come on board with us in partnership as well. They have to go to their board as well. But to facilitate the starting of a press club. I mean, that's something that is, I think the journalists in the room, and I look around and I see the gentleman there from Marlin's Business, I see Matai there, I see Vijay, these are all well-known names. I see Aman there from USAID, there are NGOs here, powerful NGOs as well. And I think the press club doesn't have to be just for the press. And what used to happen, and I'm sure you know this from Singapore, but the last one I attended was actually in Delhi. And they have their own space. They can go and have lunch there. They can bring their visitors there. They have talks. They have lectures, and people can go if they're free, usually about journalism, but also about political systems, and anything you like, really. It's open because the media are allowed to discuss anything they want. So I would, as from the university side, I would very much like a press club to be formed. And if there's anything that the university can do, we would certainly offer that assistance and that support to do that. I mean, this is my journalistic hat speaking, so I am biased, obviously, because I can see that there has been a gap in in our society for some time, where we have not been able to exercise our free speech with or without limitations. And I think the press club, as opposed to any other entity, whether it's a university or the media council or individual media, because they're all sitting in this room actually, most of the leading media people are sitting in the room, and they would be a fantastic group to instigate. So if I may move that as a motion, that the University of Fiji, number one, will support the formation of a press club.
Am I allowed to second it?
And you've given the first lecture, actually. So if I can propose that, and perhaps, Dialogue Fiji will come on board as well, and also the Fiji Media Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. Yes. So we'll transition into the conclusion of our event, conclusion of our public lecture. I'm sorry, I really love the discussion, but we really need to conclude so that the good professor can go back and enjoy his weekend. For now, I will invite our Executive Director, Mr. Nilesh Lal, to deliver the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Manwa. Manwa is our Programs Officer at Dialogue Fiji. I realized quite quickly that we've gone really over time, so I'll just take 1 minute of your time. You can actually time me for that. I'd like to sincerely thank Professor Cherian George for availing himself for this very insightful lecture that he has delivered this afternoon. In fact, I approached him just on Saturday when I heard that he was going to be in Fiji this week, because when we have such a renowned academic visiting ourselves, we need to maximize the impact that we can have from that visit.